Good morning, crime community. We continue to read out about Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Marion, and living there in destitution with the child who is the result of the rape, when by shameless authorial contrivance, Aurora, traveling south in search of poetic inspiration, chances to encounter the pair and take them in. In another tangle with reality, the fictional menage travels on to Elizabeth's own home, Florence, where they settle and where Aurora learns that the semi-autobiographical poetry manuscript she sold to fund her travels had been published as has achieved huge artist success. Back in England, Romney reads it with the admiration, understanding her at last, believing that Marianne jilted him at the altar. He has become engaged to Lady Waldemar, but the relationship sours when the letter from Aurora forces her to admit it. Eventually, Romney comes to Florence in search of her first fiancé, by whom he plans to do the right thing. But luckily for the gradually converging protagonist, Marian wishes to devote herself to the joys of motherhood and always realizes that her own love was just hero worship. After 11,000 lines, and Romney and Aurora are able to unite their social and political vocations in the concluding symbolism of their story, last an amethyst. None of this is quite as whistle-stop as it sounds. Aurora Leigh comprises a lengthy 9 books, but it does manage to be simultaneously a page-turner in the radical end. After publication, Elizabeth will admit that she's expected to be put in the stocks and pelted with the eggs of the last 20 years, singing birds as a disorderly woman, a free-thinking poet. Instead, people have been so kind that I really come to modify my opinions somewhat upon their conventionality and see the progress made in freedom of thought. Think of quite decent women taking their part of the book. The wider relationship between decent society will make the book a bestseller whose first edition sells out in a fortnight, but Elizabeth's ideal readers remain her alter ego. There's a sense of many passages that she's trying to pass on a baton of an yet unknown, perhaps even greater woman poet, but does she know it? That is exactly what she's managed. Among the many women readers Aurora Leigh will influence around the world and who subsequently become poets, from Michael Field to Charlotte Mew, is Emily Dickinson, and who will write a number of memorial praises poems. Silver perished with her tongue, not on record, bubbled other, fluid or woman, so divine. All this, though it is in the future. In 1855, Elizabeth is working away steadily in her epic Kunstelroman. The brilliant riff on ways to dismiss women's poetry comes immediately after the passage in Book 4, in which one particular man, further partner Romney, dismisses Aurora's own poetry. In particular, Aurora Leigh will become a highly influential book, and here it tells us that there is an asymmetry of the heart of heterosexuality. I held him in respect, I comprehended what he was, but he supposed me a thing too small to deign to know. He blew me plainly from the crucible, and some intruding, interrupting fly, no worth the pain of his analysis. A man treating the woman he loves like an insect, making an arresting, even disgusting image. This is going much further than a simple inquiry into a woman's writing. Once again, he should be aware that the poet is an autobiographical, especially because women poets are so readily assumed to be confessional in that vile woman's way of trailing the personal thought, but nor should we assume that either Browning is incapable of dramatizing ambivalences within their own life as fiction. As Elizabeth completes Aurora Leigh, there are changing, at any rate, beneath the surface, in an apparently happy Browning household. By contrasting with one of Britain's leading poets, Robert has gained social entry into her literary and poetic league, at which point it would be easy to forget, as many a muse has done, that there isn't in his own right. Now he's increasingly replaces his wife at literary events. Back in January 1855, while she was ill, Mr. Frederick Tennyson gave punch on the 12th night to those whom Mr. Lytton designated as the brethren, viz. Robert, Mr. Norton, and Isla Blagden. Only Elizabeth's name is missing from the list, and her growing isolation takes several forms. Though she knows other women writers, Whether good friends like Anna Jameson or esteemed acquaintances like George Sand, Elizabeth has no other serious women poets in her life. Florentine acquaintances include ladies like Mrs. Kinney, whose amateur verse is everything that Elizabeth and Aurora Leigh rejected. Still, she throws herself into aspiring and encouraging younger women who will become serious writers. Anne Thackeray and Isa Blagden, a single lady with black hair, black eyes, yet somehow not pretty, who does literature, lead a London life among the literateurs when she is in England. And not only writers, last spring the Brownings made a great pet and a perfectly emancipated female. Sculptor Harriet Hosmer, the young American who lives here all alone, dines and breakfasts at the cafes precisely as a young man would, works from 6 o'clock in the morning till night as a great artist must. This could be an exciting new role for a woman who remains a tyro herself for so long, and it's a being performed against a particular similar background of mothering little Panini, as well as the Indian machismo that infects even him. He feels his advantages belonging to the male sex to a degree that quite startles me. There's a sort of instinct in him, I suppose. One morning, Fernando spoke of some tradesman in Florence who would not only employ him. Panini broke out and suddenly with Benissimo, Tuttle de Lodon, Sone Carave, Asito, Mia Mama, Mama solamente e bono. Very good. Well, ladies are wicked except my mama. Only mama is good. Fernando Ragomali and Browning's cook, who is making his presence felt in some ways and more. It's not only Panini who adores him, but on June 1855, the day before the marriage leaves for Paris and London, he marries Wilson, now clearly recovered from her chagrin at the disappearance of the prosperous Signor Righi at the British embassy. As it simplifies the household to two married couples with just the 6-year-old Pen to look after. Many things, including traveling, should now be easier than in previous years, yet the party managed to miss the boat to Livorno and have set out all over again a week later with accidental delay turned into happy accident. Traveling via Corsica and Marseille, they bump into Elizabeth's brother Daisy in France. Oh, His Majesty's business. On June 24th, they arrive in Paris for 3 weeks at 138 Avenida des Champs-Élysées with Sarina and Robert Sr., who disgrace causes no embarrassment here. This is a happy visit, one highlight, a party where Elizabeth and Robert meet Prosper Mer Ami, François Auguste Mignette, and leading tragedienne Adelaide Rostori and philosopher Victor Cousin. On July 10th, Elizabeth Wilson becomes Miss Romagnoli, according to the Catholic rite as well as the Anglican one. Now legal under Tuscan and well under British law, the Romangolis set out next day with their employers for 3 London months to December Dorset 13th Street, less than a half a mile from Wimpole Street. Right from off, it's a sociable way. Adelaide Sartoris calls on the day they arrive. 2 days later, breakfasting with John Kenyon. The Brownings meet half America and a quarter of London. They may be visitors, but they're in the heart of the artistic and intellectual establishment. They spend time with John Ruskin, Thomas Carlyle, Frederick Leighton, and Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and Alfred Tennyson. It's a summer of artistic collegiality among distinguished peers and personal and artistic integrating not only with the poetry that both Brownings are writing, but at their joint outer life. When one late summer evening, Robert joins Tennyson in reading aloud to his friends, though Elizabeth does not, the circle gather to listen, including the painters, Ford Madox Brown and William Holman Hunt, but privately things are more complicated. In Wimpole Street, Papa's strengthening his decline, beginning to decline. He turned 70 in May and is now having daily healing sessions with a mesmerizer. Still, he's no spent force. In August, he catches Pen playing with his Uncle George at Wimpole Street, and though he doesn't quite order the child out, he demands what he is doing here. Pray for freezing the topic shut and latter in the month, moving this household out of reach to Eastbourne to the excuse of another Wimpole Street redecoration. The Brownings, our household, is changing shape too. By late August, it's apparent that Wilson is pregnant, and she's planning to go home to Lincolnshire to have the baby. Elizabeth experiences again the separation anxiety she felt when Crowe left to start a family, and indeed the circumstances are similar. Orestes Wilson Ragamoli will be born on the 13th of October, 1855, so Wilson must have fallen pregnant early in the year. Apparently, like Crowe, she felt unable to admit to her mistress that both summer ceremonies were shotgun weddings, and like Crowe, she had her reasons. After all, it's only 4 years since the Browning dismissed the Parisian cook because of her reputation, and perhaps Elizabeth knows, or at least guesses, the truth all along, and the covering for her loved and trusted intimate and her own 5 pregnancies mean she's no longer innocent, but about the physical symptoms, and the Casa Guidi apartment isn't huge. She may well have an inkling of keeping arrangements. She and Robert fight with real protective urgency to get the marriage correctly solemnized in Paris, although Fernando is clearly not contemplating abandonment. He even offers to convert a Protestantism, and writing to Arabella in the Romanicali's second wedding day, Elizabeth seems to imply that she knows more than she can, for respectability's sake, admit to. She has shed tears enough, and it is, I will tell you, all this is July. Wilson is now by 6 months pregnant and must show, but everything has their fig leaf. She's married, and her mistress can claim ignorance. Wilson, as Elizabeth tells her, Penn calls her Lily, will return to work the following July. Meanwhile, the Brownings return 4 days south, 4 days after baby Orestes saved travel, the cholera in Florence, so they will overwinter in Paris, and the left bank apartment front for them to be friends is too small, though it may be the one Annie Thackeray will remember as a little warm, sunny, shabby apartment with a wood fire always burning and a big sofa where Elizabeth sat and wrote her books out of a tiny inkstand in her beautiful, delicate handwriting. But fact is, not for the further 2 months until they move back to the neighborhood of the Champs-Élysées and 3 Rue des Colis that Elizabeth is able to return work on Aurora Leigh. Now Paris itself whose old charm, and sees on me nothing in the world except Venice is so beautiful as the city enters her story. The terraced streets, the glittered boulevards, the white colonnades, the fair fantastic Paris who wears trees like plumes, and if man made them spire and tower, and if they had grown by nature, tossing up her fountains on the sunshine of the squares. And in the real life city in which these lines are being written, the opening 3 months in 1856 are spent fair copying the novel's first 6 books. Robert's reading them as she goes. His own Men and Women have just been published, so widespread but mixed reception. The Literary Gazette finds that all the complications of crudeness, obscurity, and disorder by which the mystical and spormatic schools of poetry is marked. Blackwood's follows remarks on Elizabeth by noting that Robert Browning is the wild boy of the household, the boisterous, noisy, shouting voice that the elder people shake their heads to hear. The Athenaeum laments, who will not grieve over energy wasted and power misspent over fantasies so overhung by the 7 veils of obscurity that there is an amount of extravagant license. Elizabeth's protective instincts are aroused, understandably perhaps. She feels that the time is personal. 3 years ago, several of these publications panned Robert's ill-fated edition of Ford Shelley Letters, issued by Moxon to the unseemly merriment of critics, but now their influential friends, including Carlyle, Rossetti, who come to Paris and visit the Louvre with Robert, and Ruskin in the magisterial prose of modern painters, Volume 4, come to the rescue of the positive reviews in good company throughout the spring as Elizabeth works through the last third of Aurora Leigh and proofs her poems. 1856, Robert's social life continues to blossom. He goes to the theater with Charles Dickens and the actor William Macready and dines with Camillo Benso, Count of Cavour, the modernizing prime minister of Piedmont Sardinia, known everywhere as Cavour. And at the end of June 1856, the Brownings returned to London. This time, Ireland, as well as Britain and America, comment on the rarity of the verse novel genre. They're mostly enthusiastic First out of the gate, 5 days after publication, the Globe and Traveler decides Aurora Leigh, Miss Browning's new poem, is a wealthy world of beauty, truth, and the noblest thoughts, faiths, hopes, and charities that can inform and sanctify our human nature, while the Edinburgh Weekly Review sees its marking an epic of literature, for it is so many respects an innovation of long accepted uses in poetry, and the Athenaeum, H.F. Chorley, says that our greatest Elizabeth English poetess at any time has essayed to blend the epic with the didactic novel in her contribution to the chorus of protest and mutual exhortation, which woman is now raising in hopes of gaining the due place and sympathy which, it is held, has been denied her. Although declaring the book advocacy for women writers unnatural, he concludes that for some readers it will afford most a spiritual revelation, and so it proves, particularly among writing women. Elsewhere, the New York Daily Times calls Elizabeth blank verse a phenomenon, pure, simple, lively, visible. It is a verse as no visible pen can command in greater perfection, but it's the new fictional form blending epic poetry with the novel that is Aurora Leigh's most radical adventure and greatest achievement. Coventry Patmore, in a lengthy essay in the North British Review, makes clear these reservations about both this genre and what he sees as the great deal of hasty, under-polished writing throughout the poet's au revoir declares the nature of this accomplishment. This is a vital continuity through the whole of this immensely long work. This senses disciplined energy, that unflagging imagination, which were necessary for the composition of the greatest poem ever written by woman, is taken up in the daily news. The Albion is mastered by the form of the beauty of the whole, and so on. Perhaps ridiculously, it's George Eliot, writing in the Westminster Review, whose best gets the grand source of the professional impression produced by us by Aurora Leigh's integration of form with content. The idea of ample being, turning the role of poetess from a handicap to a strength. Elizabeth is perhaps the first woman who has produced a work which exhibits all the peculiar powers throughout the negation of her sex, which superadds to masculine vigor, breadth, and cultural feminine sublimity of perception, feminine quickness of sensibility, and feminine tenderness. Mrs. Browning has shown herself all the greater poets because she is intensely a poetess. What is the high tide of the life, and how do we know when we afloat by on it? By the time Aurora Leigh appears that Browning is back in Casa Guidi, traveling their usual route to Paris, Dijon, Marseille, Genoa, and Livorno, they arrive home on October 13th. The next month of 1857 are defined by the book's continual success. On its third edition by March, Harriet Beecher Stowe visits Casa Guidi in April, and the meeting of these two famous literary women, abolitionists, another formation of Elizabeth's international standing, but as ever, the private human experience is different. These artistic esprit d'escalier. There has been an enormous quantity of extravagance talked and written of Aurora Leigh, I wish it were all true, but I see too distinctly that I ought to have written. Still, it is nearer the mark than my former efforts, fuller, stronger, and more sustained, and one may be encouraged to push on to something worthier, but I don't feel as if I had done yet. No, indeed. And there's the ever-present threat of mortality. Treppy dies in November on March 9th, though she's 88, and dementia has made her increasingly remote. Elizabeth mourning is her heartfelt, and it is unstaged 5 weeks later when she endures a far more complex loss. On April 17th, 1857, Elizabeth Barrett Moulton dies. Barrett dies, and takes with him any hope of reconciliation with his daughter. For the last couple of years, Elizabeth has understood it would end this way. When Papa rebuffed her in the summer of 1855, she told Henrietta, I shall try nothing more, and it shall be absolutely useless, and it is irritating on one side and painful on the other, but emotions run deeper than understanding. Yet when it came to seemed insufferable, as if unforeseen, there is closure of the wrong kind, and as Elizabeth writes to Arabella, without a word, without a sign, it's like slamming the door on me as he went out. There are consolations. Julia Martin tells her Papa has written of forgiving Elizabeth Henrietta and Alfred, has married disinherited children. Stormy, who is the eldest surviving of the son's heirs, makes over a total of £15,000 over the inheritance of the trio, and maybe the long wait of resolution of any kind will be muted in the intensity of Elizabeth's following and allowing her to grieve already. For though in the first days after her father's death she can't even write a letter, Robert is surprised how she bears up. Unlike an earlier bereavement, there is no physical collapse, even if she manages to weep. But still, the losses aren't done. This summer, a month after their stay at Bagni de Lucca, Wilson's pregnancy starts to go wrong. Premature labor or miscarriage threatens, and she's ordered to bed. Once the replacement is found, she has to go back to Florence. Well, she will never return to work for the Brownings, and though Fernando stays in the service, instead, with a loan from the Brownings, she rents a lodging house by a Casa Guidi where she stays in touch with the household, keeps an eye on the Fernando, and makes more money than she did as a maid. Later, she'll move to better accommodation still, as Robert arranged for the elderly Walter Savage Landor, now suffering from dementia, to become a paying guest when his confession of violence caused Miss Landor to throw him out. This is perhaps a mixed blessing. This is an extra income that will allow Wilson to pay for Ortestes to join her in Italy. In midsummer 1857, Wilson places the family at Bagni de Lucca, is taken by Ananasuta Lena, a local woman of just under 30, who has experience in working for the very particular constituency of Englishwomen. Robert and Elizabeth remain at the spa town until the second week in October, but this summer is haunted by the gastric fever that Robert Bulwer Lytton brought with him from Florence in early August. Ananusia falls ill with almost immediately. Worse, Penn is ill for much of the second half of September. All three recover, but in the top of the bereavement, this mortal maternal terror is almost too much for Elizabeth. When I wanted repose to recover from the great shock, I couldn't get it. As Penn's illness ended by breaking me into pieces, I was particularly brittle, and it's all driving her closer to a new friend, an amateur medium called Sophie Eckley. By now, spiritualism divides the Brownings. In London, last summer, they attended a seance in Earling at which the famous Scottish medium Daniel Douglas Home manifested Robert's dead infant son, who turned out to be Holmes barefoot. Only can see why Robert would seize in such evidence with fury, which its niggling implication of an earlier child abandonment and infidel added to sheer clumsy cheek. Famously in 1864's Dramatis Personae, Robert will make his feelings clear with the excoriating poem, Mr. Sludge, the medium. Now he suspects Mr. Eckley is manipulating his wife, yet he doesn't resist when more distinguished visitors turn to the subject. For example, on the June evening of Casa Guidi, when they're joined by the American poet William Cullen Bryant, Robert's old friend, the poet Fanny Hayworth, and Nathaniel and Sophia Hawthorne. Hawthorne will record that he finds the visit haunting in another way. His hostess is kind, but so small and frail, she seems scarcely embodied at all. As Elizabeth tells Arabella, the bad winter have I had in some ways, but with not my chest. Altogether, I am not as strong as usual. I have a horrible vibrating bodily, and I'm unusually in mind to half an hour, and I am unwell, and then being well makes one uneasy again and acts and reacts. At 52, she's probably coping with the wear and tear of menopausal symptoms on top of her unusual weakness, but even Robert, who's brought a skeleton and a chest of homeopathic remedies, seems newly preoccupied by the body and its ills. Altogether, it's a subdued party that leaves Casa Guidi for France on the 1st of July, 1858. This year, they'll spend just 2 weeks in Paris, catching up with their old friends, Anna Jameson, Father Proud, and Lady Elgin, now horribly disabled by a series of strokes. On July 19th, they move out of Normandy, port to Havre. The idea is to take a halfway house for the family summer. In many ways, this works. Sariana and Robert Sr. share house. Ariana, George, and Henry, his new wife, Amelia, crossed the channel to visit Robert's best friend, Joseph Milsand, comes to stay. And it's the end of the busy stay that Elizabeth sits with Cyrus McClare for a photograph that will become Dante Gabriel's Rossetti's famous portrait, but hideously the second Rue du Paris destined to disappear under 20th century apartment blocks is quite astonishing. Bad choice for all this activity. La Hare, by the 1870s, confirmed that the European capital for tuberculosis deaths is already being mapped street by infections rates and is low-lying harbor sides areas that this is are worst affected. Do Robert and Elizabeth not notice, despite the handsome 18th century houses, that neighborhoods is poor and unsanitary? And are they simply blinded by the English dogma of healthy sea air? This will be no radical symptomatic changes in Elizabeth's subsequent health to change that she does get infected, but it's a foolish place to stay for an invalid, particularly one already suffering from a respiratory disease. The very day after Elizabeth's photographic session with the Macaire brothers and Browning's return to Paris, they all rent at 6 Rue de Castiglione for a month before setting off for home. En route to Italy, Storms turns to Genoa de Livorno, sea leg into the 18-hour nightmare and brutal reminder that these are the very waters where Shelley drowned. But this time home, they will finally get there, offers no safety either. Elizabeth's health has deteriorated so much that the Florentine winter is simply not warm and dry enough for her anymore. She must go further south. Traveling with the Eckley household, the Brownings set out straight away for Rome, whose winter climate seems healthier than its summers, but by November 24th are reinstalled at Via Bocca de Leon. Here Robert resumes his social life while Elizabeth rests up all of the travel and assiduously revises Aurora Leigh. She has her chances for what becomes the fourth edition, set off by the middle of January 1859. The couple now seems to be leading almost parallel lives, while Elizabeth sets for her portrait thrice. In March, the Field Tolford and Eliza Bridal Fox, and in May to Rudolph Leichmann, who also paints Robert. Her husband is learning to draw, tutored by the young lady Mary Mackenzie. He is also becoming a particular fan of Adelaide Ristori's acting, and in the first week of January 1859, alone, he goes through 3 productions on which she stars. The artist Frederick Leighton and across Charlotte Cushman are among of the many acquaintances often celebrated that Robert now sees sometimes 2 or 3 times deep in one night's engagements. So our older friends then, like Nathaniel Hawthorne, William Page, and the stories, so plenty of distractions and no men and women. Elizabeth frets. Political turmoil is intensifying, and Robert also meets up with the really instructed people, former ambassador Lord Stratford de Redcliffe and diplomat Odo Russell, and the Times correspondent Henry Westford. In mid-March, he's even briefed the Prince of Wales in the Italian situation of dinner. Elizabeth, equally riveted by the political events unfolding around them, tries to get Robert writing by proposing that they publish together again, this time poems celebrating the end of Austrian rule. By Austrian rule is not at an end. On May 3rd, 1859, roughly a week after Austria ends troops in Piedmont, Sardinia, France declares war on Austria. By the end of the month, when Elizabeth and Robert return home to Florence, France troops are in the city with the Austrian Grand Duke has fled. In June, the French ally with the Piedmontese, a defeat the Australian twice, and Magenta and Solferino, but in the suffer such heavy losses that they grow away the liberation they've won at so much cost. And July 11th, at Villafranca, when they make peace, while it unites Lombardy and Piedmont, returns much of northern Italy to Austrian control. The shocking decision has wide-reaching effects. The end of the beautiful dream of a free Italy is felt within the Brownings' relationship, too. Robert destroys his celebratory poem. Elizabeth keeps hers, Napoleon III in Italy, but as usual, when she's faced with a grief too big for expression, her health collapses. She's in bed for nearly 3 weeks. When the time comes for the usual summer move to the country, this time to Marciano, the hilltop village that's almost a satellite of Siena, she has to be carried from the train and is confined to bed for the first 10 days at Grimm Square, Villa Alberti, advised by Elizabeth Roman doctor E.G.T. Gronowski to seek a healthier climate. The Brownings won't return to Florence this year till mid-October. The air in Siena is indefinitely fresher than it is in Rome, and it is out of the Tiber Basin and a little further south, while not as northerly as Florence, but the Brownings squeeze in just 6 weeks at home in Casa Guidi before setting out once more for Rome on November 28th, harried south at the approaching winter. For Elizabeth's life itself is feeling increasingly unstable, traveling in the most exhausting of remedies, yet through all the comings and goings, she continues to write. The enormous set piece efforts, all her achievements, elopement, childbearing, the compositions of culminating in Aurora Leigh, not to mention the sheer effort of surviving chronic illnesses, all demonstrate her fierce will to embrace life, possibly writing her concentrate that she will be narrowing its focus. Morphine has certainly helped through this. If there were widely known, it could cause a scandal. Already in the state of this year, Robert called on Louisa Crawford to protest about her sister Julia Ward's Howe's allegations in the spiteful, slanderous poem Bald titled The Word More Than with EBB, that Elizabeth's unearthly verse, her ill-directed flight and sentence mystical and hard, is the result of a nameless drought and drug. Elizabeth's own response was to admit ruefully to Elizabeth Eckley that morphine was indeed her lifeline, and now even this isn't quite enough to manage her symptoms. Enough for imagination is certainly undimmed, and a writer's and August voice, A Tale of Villafranca and Where's Agnes, the grief-struck debunking of spiritualism. Here, as she has before, she approaches autobiographical material, slant through fiction. The poem's narrator has lost a dear friend, Agnes, who cannot come back from the dead because she's too good to have any truck with her. Then things hellish. Her ghostly manifestation must therefore be a fake, which means that Agnes is now nothing more than the sort of woman in the clay, embodiment, the worm of the clay, now mortality for all of us. The poem's speaker and its reader too, and by mouth is full of dust, till I cannot speak. Elizabeth concludes, by the late 1859, the hope that spiritualism has held out to her of transcending the normal body by itself dying, and in the end of the summer, she's sending Sophie a letter questioning some of the supernatural experiences that seem especially staggered by the younger woman. What is it that prompts Elizabeth to do so? Has the devil in some detail finally changed her mind, or is there just away from the friend's charm and faced with the increasingly grim realities of trying to stay alive, she has at last sees things clearly? Whenever her reasons, just when she's finally relinquished her belief in her father, she now rips off her own blinkers, but this time she's reward of clarity and of gathering gloom. And as the Brownings settle in their Roman winter and turn of the decade, finding accommodation suddenly cheap due to the threat of impending war, their friendship with the Eckleys melts away to a mere formality. Everything is becoming difficult now. In mid-January 1860, Elizabeth ventures on a rare outing. She and Robert go to Castellani, the jewelers, to see a fashionable exhibition of presentation swords for Napoleon III and Victor Emmanuel. One popular meeting caused meeting another, for Brownings are mobbed for autographs. Fun though this might have been in the past, now it leaves Elizabeth coughing, breathless, and suffering a arrhythmic heartbeat for days. Still, she's managing to send Chapman and Hall her poems for Congress, and proof of the new book arrives this month. Her title, advertising the collection's highly political content, comes to an abandoned Congress in Italian sovereignty that has been due to take place at this very time. In February, she composes a preface in which she implies that Britain, preoccupied with free trade, has failed properly to support Italian unification. Non-intervention in an affair of neighboring states is a highly political virtue, and non-intervention does not mean passing by on the other side when your neighbors falls among thieves. We will leave this here for another day. This is leading to the end of Elizabeth's life. So we're just going to leave it for another day, because the poetry of these women gave all the women in the world their civil rights. So we pray for peace for the women of the world, and like and share, and have a nice day.